When life doesn't make sense. We all hit those moments when life doesn't make sense. Maybe you've prayed for a breakthrough, but things only seem to get worse. Maybe you've obeyed God, but instead of seeing blessings, you're facing heartbreak, uncertainty, or loss. What do you do when God's plan doesn't look like what you expected? That's where faith comes in. Not the kind of faith that's easy when life is smooth, but the kind of faith that stands firm when everything in you wants to run. The kind of faith that says, I trust God even when I don't understand. This week, we're diving into the stories of 7 biblical heroes who faced impossible situations, and through faith, saw God move in powerful ways. Today, we begin with Abraham, a man whose faith was tested in a way that seems unthinkable. Imagine this. You've waited years, decades even, for God to fulfill his promise to you. You've prayed, believed, and finally, the miracle happens. The thing you longed for is here, and then one day, God asks you to give it up. That's what happened to Abraham. Then God said, take your son, your only son, whom you love, Isaac, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on a mountain I will show you. Genesis 22:2. Can you imagine the weight of those words? Isaac wasn't just Abraham's son, he was the fulfillment of a promise. Isaac represented everything Abraham had trusted God for, and now God was asking for him back. We don't get details about Abraham's emotions that night, but we do know what he did next. Early the next morning, Abraham got up and loaded his donkey. Genesis 22:3. No arguing, no hesitation, just obedience. Why? Because Abraham had learned something about God through the years. God always keeps his promises. To understand the depth of Abraham's faith, we need to rewind. Years earlier, in Genesis 15:5, God made Abraham a promise. Look up at the sky and count the stars, if indeed you can count them. So shall your offspring be. Genesis 15:5, Abraham believed, and God fulfilled his word. Isaac was born. So when God asked Abraham to sacrifice Isaac, Abraham had a choice. Would he trust God's character even when the command didn't make sense? The book of Hebrews gives us insight into Abraham's mindset. By faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead. Hebrews 11:17-19. Abraham didn't know how God would keep his promise. He just knew that he would, and that was enough. When Abraham and Isaac reached the mountain, Isaac asked his father, the fire and wood are here, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering? Genesis 22:7-8. Abraham responds, God himself will provide the lamb, my son. He didn't have the full picture. He didn't know how God was going to work it out, but he believed that God would, and that's the essence of faith. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting God's character even when the situation is unclear. At the very last moment, as Abraham raised the knife to sacrifice Isaac, God intervened. Do not lay a hand on the boy. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Genesis 22:12. And just as Abraham had believed, God did provide. In Genesis 22:13 we read, Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. Genesis 22:13. God never intended for Abraham to lose Isaac. The test wasn't about the sacrifice. It was about Abraham's trust. And because Abraham trusted, he saw a new side of God's nature. He called the place Jehovah Jireh. The Lord will provide. Faith is trusting God, not circumstances. Maybe you're in a season where God is asking you to surrender something. Maybe you're holding on to something so tightly that it's keeping you from trusting God fully. Abraham's story reminds us of 2 things. Faith is trusting God's promise over your circumstances. Even when what you see doesn't align with what God said, faith chooses to believe that his word is still true. Faith isn't denial. It's trust that God sees beyond what we can. God is faithful, even in the hardest tests. God didn't leave Abraham empty-handed. He provided, and he'll provide for you too. Take a moment and reflect. Is there something in your life that God is asking you to trust him with? Are you clinging to control instead of surrendering to his plan? Can you believe that even when you don't understand, God is still good? Faith means letting go. Trusting that God sees what you can't. Believing that he's working, even when you don't have all the answers. Like Abraham, may we be people who say, God, I trust you, even when I don't understand. If these stories speak to your heart, follow so that you will not miss any additions to this page. comment, and like, and share with someone else who needs to hear these stories from the Bible, rooted in truth and living out doctrine.